This video will give you an overview of the Greek verb system and an introduction to the indicative mood in particular. The idea of mood is not foreign to English speakers. We have multiple moods in the way we deal with verbs and presenting actions, although we rarely think about the moods and their names. One of the most commonly used moods is the indicative mood, which is the mood that we encounter when we are simply telling a story, telling a narration of events, presenting them as factual, whether or not they are. So if I were to tell you step by step what happened to me over the last week, what's happening now and what is likely to happen, what I'm planning on doing tomorrow, for example, I would throughout use the indicative mood. If I were to tell a story, recounting to you one of the Greek myths or something, even though that's an unreal story, I would use an indicative mood because I'd simply be relating it as if the events are occurring or have occurred. There's a real shift in mood when we move from talking about actions that have happened, are happening, or will happen, to commanding actions to happen. We shift from the indicative mood to the imperative mood. These are, by the way, the names of these moods are taken from Latin words, hence the imperator is a commander. Imperative is the mood of giving orders. So if I were to say, go to the store and buy me some milk, I've used two imperatives, go and buy. This is very different from the indicative mood because these actions are entirely dependent upon the obedience, if you will, of the one to whom I am speaking. So we're no longer in the indicative mood, talking about actions as givens, but now talking about actions that haven't happened, that we want to happen, that we've ordered to happen, but essentially haven't happened. We're looking for it yet to happen. We have in English what we call the subjunctive mood, but we think about it very rarely, and it's not very well developed in our language. But when we talk about hypothetical actions, or actions that aren't real and we're presenting them as not real, we are technically using the subjunctive mood in English. As in the common expression, if I were you, I would work harder. But of course, I'm not you. The very word were there, as opposed to if I was you, which is an indicative form, if I were you, indicates that we have shifted from the indicative mood to the subjunctive mood, moving to hypothetical actions. We also have a number of what we call verbals in English. They're verbs in a sense, but they don't really act purely as verbs. They often act the way nouns act, or the way adjectives or even adverbs act. And so they're not technically called verbs, they're called verbals because of their mixed nature. We are used to dealing with infinitives in English. To be or not to be. Those are infinitives, to be. To boldly go. That is an infinitive with an adverb stuck in for good measure. An infinitive is the stripped down action itself. The barest way we can refer to an action in English. Hence, to heal or to be healed. we might notice that just as we have different tenses in English, we can talk about past action, present action, and future action. So we also have different tenses in infinitives. We can talk about healing just pretty in a non-committal fashion, like to heal, but we can also talk about it in a past fashion, like to have healed and to be done with the action of healing. We also have participles in English, and these have a verbal component and an adjectival, or sometimes an adverbial component to them. So for example, when we describe God as the one sitting on the throne, sitting is a participle. It is obviously most closely related to the verb to sit, but it has been turned into a form that no longer talks about the bare action of sitting, he sits on the throne, but has been turned into a form that can describe another noun as exhibiting this action, the one sitting on the throne. These moods exist also in Greek alongside one other in particular. For the most part, we're going to find that the way the Greek language conceives of moods is roughly parallel to the way English conceives of moods. So when we think about indicative verbs in Greek, we are in fairly familiar territory. As in English, Greek uses the indicative mood largely to narrate events or to forecast events. So if I were speaking in Greek and I were to say, I was walking down the road yesterday when a man stopped me and asked for directions, or tomorrow I'm going to go from my city to another one and go shopping or go to the beach or some such thing, I would be using the indicative mood throughout that narration. Greek also has imperatives, just as we have in English. Greek speakers give direct commands just as we do. Go to the store and buy milk for me. You could do exactly the same thing in Greek with imperative forms of the verb go and buy. We will find that there are a few variants in Greek that we don't have in English. For example, in English, largely we only use commands to talk to the person in effect in front of us. Do this, do that, go there, come here, whatever. Greek has a form of indirect command that we simply don't use in English anymore, although it used to be quite common. And this is a third person indirect command. And we encounter it reading scripture all the time because we're translating Greek. But in normal parlance, we would never say, let the light be turned on. Let someone go to the store and buy milk. We just don't do indirect commands like that, at least not very often and almost never outside of church settings. Greek also has a subjunctive mood, which is much more fully developed than in English. Greek uses verbs in the subjunctive mood for a wide variety of purposes, and we will of course explore each one of those in turn. Greek has something called an optative mood, which is a set of forms of any verb used to talk about actions that are merely presented as possibilities or as things that we might wish for. So in regard to things we might wish for, they're even further removed from reality than imperative actions, where we command someone to do something. Here we are simply wishing that something might happen. Again, with the indicative, we talk about actions that have happened, or are happening, or will happen, as if those are real, all real actions. With the optative, we would be talking merely about possible or potential action. Someone could benefit from investing in this stock portfolio. I'm having trouble coming up with decent examples today. It's Sunday afternoon and had a very full morning at church. So that will be a mood that is not paralleled, at least to my knowledge, in English grammar. Greek also has infinitives and participles, and in some basic ways, these are used in the same way as we are accustomed in English to using infinitives and participles. But due to the complex possibilities that Greek lends to grammar, there are some uses of both of these that will be unfamiliar to English readers, English speakers, and we will look closely at those also when we get to those moods. Now, in thinking about the verb, it's very important that we think both about verb tense and verb aspect. Verb tense refers to the time of the action that is represented in the verb. Aspect refers to the kind of action, the quality of the action that is represented in the verb. In English, we have multiple tenses. We have the present to talk about what's happening right now. We have the past to talk about what happened prior to the now. We have the future to talk about what will yet happen after the now. We actually also have a number of perfect tenses, which really talks about completed action in various times. We have what we would technically call a present perfect. If I were to say, I have preached, I'm not merely drawing attention to the fact that sometime prior to the now I gave a sermon, but I'm also calling attention to the fact that in the now I am done preaching. I have preached, and now that utterance is out and I am done. We can push back in time more than one step. We have what we call a past perfect. In many languages is called a pluperfect, a more than or beyond perfect. Not just action that is completed by the now, but action that was completed at some point prior to the time before the now. So I could say not simply I preached at some point in the past, but I had preached at some point in the past prior to sitting down, so that the action of preaching is clearly presented as prior to the action of sitting. In fact, I use the word prior, so that's kind of cheating, but I could just say, I had preached and I sat down. You would know just from the verb tenses that the action of preaching came before the action of sitting. And we also have a future perfect, which is a way of talking about an action in the future being completed before another action in the future. As in the example, I will have preached before you take up the offering. Planning next Sunday service, for example, you might find yourself saying that in order to indicate the relative timing of two future events. All of these perfect tenses also exhibit a completed aspect. That is to say, the quality of the action related to the perfect tense also has a particular aspect attached to it, and that is of completed action. This distinguishes perfect tenses from our, I want to say, more typical tenses, our simpler present, past, and future tenses. Each of these three tenses can be either simple or progressive, even in English. Simple just points to the action. A progressive form points to the action in progress. So the simple form just draws attention to the activity. The progressive form draws attention to the activity going on over some time. So if I were simply to say, I preach every Sunday. I don't, I'm just making up examples. I preach every Sunday, or I read. I'm just drawing attention to the fact that I do this activity in the present. But if I say, I am preaching, I am drawing attention to the fact that this activity is ongoing. Even if it's not happening at the very moment, if I were to say, I am preaching at Port Charlotte United Methodist Church, that gives us a sense of repeated, ongoing, habitual action, which is more than simply, I preach. Same thing, perhaps even more clearly, in regards to past action. I could simply say, I preached, which points to an action that I performed at some point in the past. But if I were to say, I was preaching, I would be drawing attention not simply to the past action, but to the past action as it was unfolding. And we often do this to draw attention to an interrupting action. I was preaching last Sunday when the organist fell on the keyboard and made a crashing noise. There I have a past progressive form, I was preaching, and a past simple form, the organist fell, which interrupts then the action in progress that I use the progressive form to name. We don't always do that, of course. I was preaching at that church for years before I realized it wasn't doing any good, so I stopped giving sermons. We could just use it to talk about habitual action in the past. Similarly with the future tense, we could talk about, we could point to the action itself, I will preach, simple, or we could point to the action as it will be unfolding. I will be preaching, however you care to fill that out. I will be preaching there for 3 months. I will be preaching next week, and you're invited into that space of the sermon to come listen to me. Point being, in English, in everyday English, we have multiple tenses, and we give attention to aspect, whether we're presenting an action just as itself, a simple aspect, where we're drawing attention to the action as it unfolds, as it's in progress, a progressive aspect, or whether we're drawing attention to the action as something that is now completed and done, and we're on the other side of having done it. So while we're accustomed to both tense and aspect in English, what is different is that we tend to rely on helping verbs to communicate aspect. Notice, for example, in the progressive aspect, we're always using a form, an ing form of the verb, a participle form of the verb, with the helping verb, the verb to be, whether it's present or past or future of the verb to be. With the completed actions, that with the perfect tenses, we're always using some form of the helping verb to have. In Greek, we still will encounter time or tense and aspect, but the forms themselves will communicate all this within a single word. We'll get all that information, as it were. Greek almost never uses helping verbs the way that English does. That's because Greek is a highly inflected language. That is to say, the form of a given word can keep changing. We can see that word in many different forms. For example, with the noun, I didn't draw any attention to this as we were working with the noun because, of course, the point is not to teach you Greek paradigms and make you learn the endings, but simply to be able to interpret the grammatical information that is readily available to us now using Bible software or what have you. But maybe you noticed words are often spelled differently at the end, and the spelling of that last syllable correlates with whether it's a nominative, a genitive, a dative, or an accusative form of that noun. By simply changing the ending, Greek is able to communicate the grammatical role of a noun. Greek verbs are also, and in fact even more highly inflected than nouns. And so we'll find changes not only at the end of verbs, but at the beginnings of verbs, in the middles of verbs, all kinds of changes, which you will not be subjected to if you're encountering this as part of the Encountering Scripture Beyond Translations course, because again we're relying on the morphological information, the grammatical information that Bible software is able to give us. In Greek, a single word can be a complete sentence, and that is because the ending of a verb reveals the subject of the verb, and in effect stands in for the subject or as a subject of that verb in many sentences. Thus, where we need two words in English to name a subject and name an action, Greek uses one word and changes the ending. Here, for example, from O to Amen changes the subject from I to we. And the change from O or Amen to simply A changes the subject to he or she. This gets even more complicated then when we move from the present tense to the past tense. We'll begin to see changes at the beginning of a verb. So if I were, for example, to insert the letter epsilon before pisteo amen, I'd have pisteo amen, and I would have turned this from we believe into we were believing, we were trusting, or even we used to trust. So Greek is, again, highly inflected, and those who learn Greek all the way learn to distinguish the variety of changes that happen within the Greek verb, so that they can see what mood we're dealing with, what time, what tense, and thereby also what aspect, and also who is doing the action or being done to, and also something called voice, whether the verb is active or passive. This brings us to another topic where Greek largely overlaps with English. Our verbs, our verbal system, also has two voices that Greek does. We have an active voice and a passive voice. When the verb moves, or let me start that again, when the subject impacts some object, the voice of that verb is active. The dog bit the man. The action of bit is moving from the subject to the direct object. The dog bit the man. Passive in English is the opposite. This is where the action moves toward the subject, or the action impacts the subject, and the originator of the action is revealed elsewhere other than the subject. So the man was bitten by the dog is a passive voice sentence, because the direction of the biting is not going from the subject to an object, but from an agent back to the subject. The man was bitten by the dog. Greek has these voices and uses them in ways that are just as we do, so quite familiar. But then Greek has a third voice, a middle voice, which is a new category for English speakers. If you are familiar with certain Romance languages, like French or actually, I shouldn't speak for Spanish, I don't know, but I think I remember my sons who are all, or have all taken Spanish in high school, telling me that Spanish, like French, has a reflexive form, a reflexive voice, as it were, when the subject does something to himself or herself. Those languages are closer, then, to Greek than to English. We only have the two voices. The middle voice in Greek can be used reflexively. Again, as in French, for example, if I were to brush my teeth, in French I would say je me brosse les dents. I brush myself the teeth. In English we don't have anything like that. Greek does, like French and other Romance languages, and so we might find occasionally a Greek verb in the middle voice telling us that this action was performed by the subject, so it's still kind of active. It was performed by the subject, but it chiefly impacted the subject, so it's kind of passive. Hence, the designation of this voice as middle, somewhere in between. Kind of active, and yet, or I should say definitely active, and yet the subject is impacted or invested in the action in a more distinctive way than typically. Sometimes the middle voice is used to underscore the subject's personal interest in the action. So, for example, I could, in Greek, simply use an active voice form of preaching and say, I preach the gospel. But what if I were to use a middle form of preaching? I might be indicating thereby that I preached the gospel and I did it in my own interest. I did it to my own benefit in some way. There are not all that many true middle voice verbs in the Greek New Testament. It is interesting to come across them when they appear. For example, in Hebrews 1, round about verse 2, we read about Jesus having made purification for sins, but the form for having made is not an active form, but a middle form, which is simply a subtle way by which the author reminds the hearers of Jesus' personal investment in making purification for sins. It wasn't something he simply did over here, but something that he personally involved himself in. Of course, we're talking about his giving of himself, his death on the cross. Most of the verbs that we encounter in the Greek New Testament that are used in the middle voice are verbs that never appear in the active voice and almost never appear in the passive voice. These tend to be called deponent verbs. They are defective in a sense because they don't have active forms at all. And again, the meaning of all of these verbs simply underscores the fact that the middle voice is used whenever the subject is personally involved in the action. So the verbs for coming and going in Greek are middle voice, deponent verbs. But you can perfectly well understand why I don't go or come in the same way that I throw a ball. I can throw a ball and remain completely unchanged and where I started. But I can't come or go without moving my own tuchus from one place to the next. So I am doing this action, but I am personally invested in the action. I am doing it in some sense to myself as much as to anything else. Verbs like welcoming and praying or receiving are also deponent verbs. They only appear in middle voice, and sometimes, depending on the context, passive voice. But you could well understand why. When you're praying, you are deeply personally involved in the action itself. When you receive either something as a gift or someone as a guest, you are not merely acting on that object. You are personally involved in the action yourself, and if in the case of receiving, for example, you are benefiting from the action. So we will actually encounter a lot of verbs that are middle voice in Greek, but if you remember this basic principle, middle voice underscores the subject's personal involvement in some sense in the action, then that will probably not be too mysterious, a new feature of the grammar. When we think about the indicative mood in Greek, we are, as in English, going to be thinking about tense and aspect. When we look at a particular tense in Greek, there already is kind of an associated aspect with it. So, for the most part, the present tense in Greek actually makes no distinction between simple and progressive action. What that means is Greek speakers didn't really think that was important. So while we encounter translations that will choose either a simple translation of a Greek word like kerusso, that's the Greek word for I preach. We could see it translated I preach or I am preaching, but essentially that is a decision made by the translator based on what he or she thought fit better. The Greek speaker, the Greek culture, never really developed the wherewithal to make that distinction. I say that, and I have to immediately correct myself. They did develop the wherewithal to make that distinction, but not using a present indicative form. They had to develop a circumlocution, and we will encounter those when we talk about participles. So all that to say, this is basically a point of non-alignment between English and Greek. We can make this distinction, and we regularly do make this distinction between simple or progressive action in the present. Greek speakers tended not to make that distinction. They did, however, carefully make that distinction in regard to past action. So we will encounter the imperfect tense in Greek. And what the imperfect tense is in Greek is what the past progressive tense is in English, the I was preaching form. Action in progress prior to the now. We will encounter a tense called the aorist tense. Aorist is essentially a transliteration of a Greek word that means undefined, undelimited. So it's basically pointing to the action itself and not adding a nuance about the quality of the action. So the aorist would be the Greek equivalent of our simple past, I preached. We're learning a little bit of new vocabulary here, whereas in English, let's see if I can find that slide again. In English, we talked about simple past or progressive past. In regard to Greek, we're going to talk about the aorist, and just think simple past, and the imperfect progressive past. Greek also has perfect forms, which, as in English, indicate completed action. And again, as in English, hinting at ongoing results in the present. So, English considers I have preached to be a present tense with a perfect aspect. Perfect tense with a completed aspect. I'm talking about right now, and in the now, I'm done preaching. I have preached, and I've completed that action. Greek, similarly, uses the perfect tense to talk about an action that is done, and perhaps even to throw more emphasis on the resulting state of having done that action. Thus, we will I won't say often, but we will from time to time find a Greek perfect form translated with an English present form. And that is not a mistranslation, that is merely throwing more weight on the results of the completed action rather than the completing of that action. Hence, what in Greek we might see as I have stood, as in I have stood up, might be translated I am standing. Well, that makes perfect sense, because the point of I have stood up is to indicate I'm no longer sitting, I am standing. It's just a point of where we're going to throw the emphasis in the English translation. Although, of course, the whole point of this is that in Greek, the Greek speaker doesn't choose between drawing attention to the completed action and to any results of that completed action. By simply using the perfect, the Greek speaker communicates both. Greek also has a pluperfect, just like English. I had preached, indicating either simple or completed action in the past before the past, as it were, in the past before some other past action happened. Greek doesn't make any distinction between a simple pluperfect or a completed pluperfect, but then neither does English. And Greek has future, a future tense. Although, like the present, it doesn't make a distinction between future simple or future progressive. Again, it just wasn't something that Greeks tended to find important to make a distinction about. So again, that's a point of some non-alignment. We would actually have two different ways of expressing a future action, whereas Greeks would have had one, essentially. As we think about the Greek verb, and especially what might be exegetically significant, as we compare, to the extent that we can, extant translations with the underlying Greek text, it seems to me that aspect is really the key concept. Greek speakers clearly distinguished between progressive action, completed action, and undefined action in some tenses, particularly the past tenses, the imperfect, the perfect, and the aorist, respectively. Because they had a choice, the choices they made are significant, and we should observe and try to understand those choices. So, perfects, imperfects, and aorists communicate more than this action happened at some point prior to the now. The choice that a Greek author makes communicates the quality of the aspect every bit as much as the pastness of that action. Once we leave the indicative mood, as we will be doing with the imperative and infinitive shortly, aspect will be the only focus of the verb tense. We will talk about present imperatives and aorist imperatives, but we're no longer talking about present time and past time commands at all. We're talking about the quality of the action commanded, whether it is a progressive command or a simple command. And once again, the possibility of the Greek authors making this choice, deciding, I'm going to give this command as an aorist command. No, I'm going to give this command as a present command. Makes it important to observe this distinction in translation and when we're explaining a text, because it is part of the intentionality of composition of these pastoral documents.